Hi, Rob. Welcome to another episode of Football Unspoken. I've got a trivia question for you today, which is can you tell me who was the youngest Premier League scorer of all time?
And I'm gonna go Rooney.
None of those are correct. I personally would have gone for Wayne Rooney myself, but the actual answer is a player I don't think you would have heard of because I hadn't either. And he's not, uh, a 1960s player either. It's James Vaughan. He played for Everton and he played for Norwich in the Premier League, along with a whole bunch of other EFL teams, and he only retired in 2022.
Oh wow.
James Vaughan was one of these players who scored early and had a lot of media hype. Now, looking to the modern day, we've got players like Ethan Waneri coming through the Arsenal Academy, scoring at 17 years old, so it's very similar to James Vaughan scoring at 16 years old. And then we've got pundits such as Joe Cole, likening Waneri to Messi and players like that, which has got me thinking, is the English media setting up Ethan Waneri for failure?
I still think that it comes down to the player at the end of the day. Like it comes down to the player, it comes down to the club as well, the club environment, because you have to have at least one or two people talking to Ethan Ranieri pretty much every day, going, don't get a big head, keep your feet in the ground. This is the way. And Micah Richards actually speaks about it quite a lot because obviously he spoke about how he burst onto the scene as defender, which is pretty impressive in itself. But he kind of bought into his own hype. And I think at the time where you think about the Manchester City team he came up through, there weren't many real world class leaders. They obviously had a couple of very good players coming in and out because he was in and around that like the when they started becoming a big team. But I do think that there weren't enough of the big name leaders in that squad to be able to keep his feet on the ground. Whereas I think in Arsenal, you've got Mikel Arteta, who's already quite a good man manager. You've got Martin Odegaard, who was probably the most overhyped youngster of all time. Whereas I look at some of the other young players, they didn't seem to have the same level of player around them. So to say that they're setting him up for failure, it feels harsh. But is the hype is the hype necessary? No, I don't think it is for young players.
And maybe the ratio of young, hyped players to experienced heads in the dressing room is kind of like the new metric. Instead of XG, you have XL, like expected leaders in the dressing room or something along those lines. But it seems to be the case because when I look at Manchester United, and they had at a very similar period, they had Pogba, who was still young, Rashford was coming through, Lingard was coming through, all in that similar group. And you were saying how Micah Richards speaks about his time at Manchester City coming hype. I've heard Rooney, because he was on his way out, speaking about that new group, that new wave of Manchester United youngsters coming through, and how after the matches, I say this tongue in cheek, but also seriously, after the game, the music's going and they're dancing in the change room or whatever. Rooney told them to cut it out. It's not how you behave yourself. And they kind of not exiled him, but he was the weird one in the dressing room by telling them that. And it's kind of interesting because, like I say, the ratio was almost off there, where there was all these young heads who were buying into the hype in the dressing room and not enough leaders. Then Rooney left, and there was just no leaders basically left in that dressing room. And you can see how that played out for players such as Rashford, such as Lingard, etc. There's also plenty of other examples I can give. I'm going to direct the conversation back towards the Arsenal element because the one concern I have for Waneri is at the moment, he's in the team because Arsenal have major injuries to Martinelli, to Saka, to Havertz, etc., and that allows Waneri to get into the team and then build up this hype. My concern is, does he actually get many minutes in the team when all those players come back? And you're always going to have injuries, etc. But if he gets dropped out of the team and he only gets bit part minutes or sub minutes every couple of games, then the media kind of turn on him and say, "Oh, well, yeah, you see, he was never worth the hype anyway." The confidence starts to drop, and particularly for a young player, that's going to be hard to deal with. And that's why the initial question was, are they actually setting him up for failure? The expectations are too high, and he's in a bubble at the moment that could easily pop.
I think he's definitely there's a chance that he's in a bubble, but even with the injuries, I still don't think he's getting as much time as he probably deserves. And then when those injuries come back, I still sit there and I'm like, realistically, the guy's shown a lot more than what Martinelli has this year. And the example I'll throw out to you is Kobe Mainu. Kobe Mainu came in because of injuries. You know, he became a regular starter. He was obviously in and around the conversation. But the reason why he got to go on England international duty was because of injuries to players in the Manchester United squad. And then he should be playing regularly. And so I think, yeah, there's an element of potentially the media setting him up for failure and the media creating this hype bubble. But a lot of it comes down to mismanagement. And I think if these players come back in and we see much less of Ethan Wanyeri, I'm looking at Arteta and going, "What are you doing? You've got one of the best young players in the Premier League, and you're going to have him sit on the bench consistently." And like a good example would be Lewis Skelly. I think he's a very good player, but he's a worse player than Wanyeri is in my mind. And I sit there and it feels like Lewis Skelly's been given more opportunities than Wanyeri has, despite the fact that the injury ratio to their positions are pretty similar. So I just think that, yeah, there's an element of the media, and I'm not a fan of the media in general. I always think they overhype things, especially being a Newcastle fan at the moment, where 90% of our squad is going to get sold to Liverpool, Arsenal, Man City, or PSG. So I'm not trying to defend them at all, but I think that the media's job is to create hype at the end of the day. And if a player fails to live up to that hype, I'm not sure you can't necessarily blame the media as long as they're not dogpiling on it. I think if we get to the end of next season and Ranieri's being dogpiled because he doesn't get minutes, then it's the media's fault. But there's also a question about why is Arteta not giving him a chance?
Is Arsenal having, by the standards of their squad, a poor season, in your opinion?
Yes, I'm going to be 100% honest. Yes.
Yes, and as building on that, something I've noticed over time in just watching a lot of Premier League is when teams are struggling, that's when they try to bring in these young players and they tend to stand out a little bit. I can name a whole bunch of teams. Man United under Moyes were having a bad period. They had Jan Yazai come through and he was a stand-up player. But then when they got Semi back on their feet, he kind of dropped out of that squad. With Chelsea, they under Lampard, that when they were struggling, then Mason Mount come through, and then when they got back on their feet, he kind of was surplus to requirements, and he ends up getting sold. So my point is, a lot of the time, these youngsters are being introduced at a bad period of time, a bad run of form for the club. You're looking for options. Then when that club gets back on track, they fall away by the wayside. My concern with either Waniri is Arsenal are not having a good season right now, and they got injuries to compound that problem. And that's why I say I think there's a good chance that he's being overhyped in the next few years. You could see him not playing and being sold off to another club.
I I get what you're saying, but I don't necessarily agree just because, yeah, I did say that Arsenal are underperforming, but they're not that level of underperforming, you know? They're 10 points away from what you'd expect kind of thing. It's the losses against West Ham is an underperformance, but they're not lounging in sixth at the end of the day. Like, they're underperforming. Manchester City are massively underperforming. So I think when we're talking about what the squad can actually do compared to an actually underperforming team, I think that's quite a harsh analysis of where Arsenal are, which is kind of funny considering you're the Arsenal fan. And at the end of the day, that whether that's overhyped, whether that's whatever, it could also just be the exuberance of youth. I mean, you see a lot of young wingers between 18 and 22 are fantastic, and then they hit 24 and they stop taking on as many players. They start trying to fold more into a system. I think Jack Grealish is a fantastic example of that, where the type of winger he was when he was younger is being coached out of him a little bit now, and his evaluation has dropped. And so I think again, you're looking at it where, yeah, there was hype around him, but how much of Jack Grealish's downfall is on the media hype around him when he was playing well compared to how badly he's integrated into that Manchester City squad. And I think it's the same thing with Ethan Ranieri.
Overall, it's been a very interesting discussion about media hyping of young English players. We'd love to hear what you guys think. Rob and I seem to have come to a consensus that at the end of the day, the English media do overhype the players, but at the same time, it's not the media who's on the pitch week in, week out performing the role of the player. And therefore, we've come to the consensus that performance first, media later. If you have a different opinion, let us know in the comments below. Until next time, this has been Football Unspoken. Cheers.